Okay, ASL 1, History of Deaf America. Okay, so the 1800s. So we know that in 1817, Laurent Clerc and Thomas H. Gallaudet started the first school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. Okay, graduates from this school then went around America and not only spread the use of ASL and kind of like standardized ASL, but also started other schools for the deaf. We also know that in 1864, President Lincoln signed the charter to open up Gallaudet University. Okay. In 1880, there was the International Congress on Education of the Deaf in Milan, Italy. Okay. This Congress had decided that they were going to ban the use of sign language in the classroom. So teachers couldn't use sign language whether they were deaf or hearing. Children couldn't use sign language in the classroom. If a kid was caught signing, slapped on the hand with a ruler, maybe their hands were tied behind their backs, sit on their hands until their hands went numb. Okay, because of this ban, the oral method became the preferred way of teaching deaf kids. So the oral method is just speech and lip reading. Okay, but we know lip reading, only 30% of English is lip readable. Talking to a deaf person isn't effective. Okay, let me move me up here so we can see the bottom. So in order to combat this ban, okay, the NAD, the National Association of the Deaf, was founded in Cincinnati, Ohio. The NAD, like as a whole, just to label it, is just to fight discrimination against the deaf community. Okay, so they fight against the oral method, okay, making sure that sign language can be used. Okay, they fight for deaf people and their right to become teachers. They fight for, or they used to have to fight for deaf people being allowed to get a driver's license, for deaf people to be able to adopt children. Okay, they were also afraid that if this ban continued, then sign language would stop being used more and more slowly over time, and it becoming a dead language or an extinct language. And they didn't want that to happen. So George Vedetz made a series of films called The Preservation of Sign Language, and he just signed about a bunch of different random topics, just so that we can see and have documentation and videos of what sign language used to be. Okay. In the 1900s, or at least the early 1900s. So because of this ban of sign language, deaf teachers were getting fired, kids weren't allowed to sign. It was just a bad time. So that time period from the 1900s after the ban and the 60s, they were called the Dark Ages. There's a lack of information going on. There's a lack of sign language. So deaf people, in order to combat this, formed deaf clubs. Okay, these are just places where deaf people can socialize, get caught up on information, whether it be about their community members and their friends, or if it's about the world and maybe what's going on in other countries, the world news. Maybe it's around politics. They were also there to plan other events and to watch captioned films. So putting captions on everything was not as easy as it is today. So back in the early 1900s, it would take years for a film to come out with captions. So the hearing world gets to see a new movie. Years later, the deaf community finally gets to see it with captions so that they can be able to understand what the dialogue is, what the movie's about. Okay. In 1901, the National Fraternal Society of the Deaf was established to provide insurance. Okay, so insurance companies pay for if you go to the doctor, get put in the hospital. Okay, so they're thinking that if a person is deaf, that they're going to be in the doctor's office or in the hospital a lot. Or if they're deaf, they have other health conditions that are going to make them see the doctor or go to the hospital a lot. So they would either not provide not accept that deaf person to be on their insurance in their insurance company, or they would charge them a lot of money. So the NFSD provided insurance to make sure deaf people got insurance. It was at a fair rate, equality for everybody. And then we get to World War II. Because everybody was off to war, a lot of jobs opened up. And one job that they were able to get were printers, newspaper printers. Because it was easy for a deaf person to just make copies of the same page, put the stamps on, press, there you go. Again. Okay, so the 60s and the 70s a lot happened. Okay? 1964, a deaf man invents a TTY. TTY is like OG texting. So you have a machine that looks like a typewriter, and there's a screen on it where you can see what you're typing, and then you put a house phone on top. Okay, so once you call the other person and they answer on their TTY, you would type what you want to say, and it'll come across your screen so you can read what you're typing. But it'll also come across the screen on the other person's TTY so they can read what you're saying. And then when you're done typing, you write GA, go ahead. Okay? So as soon as the other person sees that GA, then they know they can start typing their response, and they'll type and it comes up on your screen. Okay? In 1964, the National Registry of Interpreters was founded. It is now called RID. They have since changed their name. But the RID makes sure that there is like a standard of interpreters. You get certified through RID so that we know that you have at least this minimum of skill level so that people who don't have skill level aren't out there interpreting, providing misinformation. And if you don't provide the information correctly or at all, it could be actually really dangerous for a deaf person, especially if it's with some type of emergency, right? A natural disaster, medical emergency, something like that. Interpreters are really important. In 1965, William Stokey conducted the first linguistic study of ASL. So William Stokey proved that ASL is in fact a language. He realized that ASL, every single sign, has those 5 parameters: the hand shape, the palm orientation, the location, the movement, and then later when you put them in a sentence, your non-manual behaviors. Okay, so he realized this, broke all the signs down, and he's like, ASL is a language. Okay, so because of this, total communication begins to gain acceptance. Total communication is teachers and people are going to use whatever means necessary to teach a deaf child. So if it means the oral map, speech and lip reading, if they can hear a little bit, signing, gestures, writing, whatever needs to happen so that that deaf kid can learn, totally fine. Okay. In 1966, deaf people can finally adopt. People thought if that you can't hear a baby cry, then that puts them in danger, that you shouldn't be able to adopt. You can't take care of deaf kids. In 1967, the National Theater of the Deaf had their first national tour. In 1970, TV decoders were invented. This is captions for regular TV. Okay, so they weren't always automatically built into the TV. They had to, you had to buy a special machine that hooked up into your TV so that they would appear. Okay. Then in 1976, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was signed into law. So it states that any place, any business that receives money from the government has to be accessible to all disabled people. So that means wheelchair ramps. That means smoke detectors and fire alarms that aren't just sound, but also flashing. That means providing TTYs. Okay, that means putting braille on outside each door for the door numbers. If your place isn't providing all of that, isn't accessible, then you could stop receiving federal funds. Okay, in 1979, the movie Voices was boycotted because a hearing person portrayed a deaf person. That would be like a white actor going in blackface. Okay, deaf roles should be played by deaf people, and we're seeing that a lot right now. There's a big deaf talent movement. Okay, so more recently, ASL has gained academic success. That's why you're in this class instead of Spanish or French. And right now it is accepted for about 90% of colleges to get into that school. Okay, that website there, aslcolleges.com, you can click on, it's a US map, click on, let's say, California, and it'll show you all the schools that list it, that accept ASL for admissions or not. Okay? Deaf people are put into decision-making positions, and then we know about DPA. Okay, maintaining relationships. This is just a reminder. As you are out making new friendships in the deaf community, we are sharing a lot of information about ourselves. We are remembering that information about the deaf people that we meet, so that that's how you make friends, that's how you make connections, so that you're no longer dependent on me to make those friendships for you.